Gino felt it too, a cross wave of vibration, a shivering of the car that didn't harmonize with the faint vibration of the plastic seats and the metal floor. And then the train braked. It braked with a suddenness that rattled vertebrae like dominoes. And everybody became rodeo cowboys in their seats, and then darkness, profound darkness, like when he toured a cavern and the state park guide had switched off the lights so they could experience geological absolutes. And then a scream of metal that sounded almost apologetic, and a sizzle of breaking glass, and he lost his seat entirely as the world pitched him over its shoulder. And direction, as a thing in itself, was uncreated. And Gino had a new relationship to gravity. Bodies pummeled him, and people wailed and sirened so loudly from so deeply, Gino could feel the twisting weight of their bodies in the sound. After that, a cymbal crashed against the side of his head, and he heard Telly screaming like a baby, and the sound got very faint and distant and vanished in the silence. When Gino came to, it was to a cold wetness on his right side and wet warmth on the other. His thoughts were almost immediately clear, and he was surprised at his own comforting detachment. He knew with a knife-like certainty that there'd been an earthquake, and he was in a tunnel under the bay. He knew he was lying atop a wet stack of bodies in the darkness, and in blood and seawater and a thin scum of sewage from ruptured viscera. He knew it had been a big earthquake, and they were halfway across the bay and under thousands of tons of water, and no one would ever rescue them. He knew he'd been hit in the head and knocked out, and something was still breaking in his head. But he was sure somehow that it had only just happened. No more than a minute had passed, and maybe it was the energy and the screams and the flailing around him. It was the energy of a fresh catastrophe. The screaming, though, came to him filtered through a buzzing in his head. He was fairly sure that one of his eardrums had burst. There was pain in that ear, but it seemed unreal. And that surprised him, too, in an insular kind of way. Pain ought to be the realest thing of all, but mere pain had no rank here. Both fear and pain were subordinate to the seeking cone of perception, the exploratory probe of a terminating life. Two of his senses, smell and taste, had mostly shut down. He knew this meant that the rest of his senses would shut down, that the oozing chill in one corner of his skull was spreading, would shut him down. These realizations were not articulated for Gino. They were experienced the way one experiences the cold surface of a concrete wall under the fingers. Experimentally, he tried to move. It didn't hurt more to move than to lay still. He began to crawl. A hand flapped in his face. Fingernails, probably a woman's, dug into his cheek, and he pulled his head back in reflex, but otherwise ignored it and kept moving. Sometimes the wailing ebbed, and there was only a vocal rasping, a murmuring, like the sounds of an unseen flock of birds, and then the wailing would resume. One sound was equal to another. Gino turned, and his eyes cleared, and he saw that now there was a little light, yellowish light from below mostly, and a faint sheen of red light from the sides, and after what might have been a full minute of looking, he knew that the yellow light was from the rear of the car, which was now directly below him. The BART tunnel had curled like a bent finger, knuckled under to the buckling of the Earth's crust, to a wedge of strata jammed upward, sheer as a seismographic spike. Horizontal had become vertical, and everyone was pressed down into the tin can of the car by body weight and by slowly increasing water and by mud coming in through widening seams of metal and by thickening blood. And more bodies had come in from the second to the last car, gravitationally forced through the shattered door, packing, cramming this lower car so full there were only a few crawl spaces left. Yet there were apertures, wet and ready places that seemed to be there for him, for this moment, for whatever remained to Gino. The bodies under him in that moment were rearranged by the dynamics of suffering, and parted legs and tilted torsos shifted at angles to create a kind of wriggling shaft, a space letting more light through, and down through which blood and piss and brown scum and seawater trickled, in no hurry, like a spring oozing from a muddy hillside, a living crevice, maybe 50 feet deep, and at the bottom of it he saw parts of the security guards that he'd seen earlier. The lady, perhaps alive, seeming to wriggle with life, but maybe just shaken by the twitchings around her. The man split open. You could see the yellow fat through the ruptured belly, a mock layer cake of exposed fat and intestinal tissue garnished by a splintered rib, and somehow the flashlight had been turned on, the guard's flashlight, maybe by one of the hands groping from the layers of people, and the flashlight's butt had slipped into the fat man's gouged open belly, which quivered with the movement of struggling bodies, shimmying the light up the shaft of bodies. Was that a rainbow in a spill of piss and seawater? And playing over faces, some of them alive and staring with a disbelief almost identical to the staring dead, but for the randomly tracking eyes, and some profoundly identified with hurt, and some trying to claw their way out and too stupid for despair in that moment. There was a man whose interior had been pressed out through his mouth, and he was choking on his own throat and died as Gino watched. About 2 layers of people down from the top, a hand thrust out into the crevice, and there was a tattoo of a flying pig on the brown and streaming wrist of that hand. It was his friend Telly's hand. Gino reached down and tugged and thought the arm was going to come free, torn away, but after a short wet slide it resisted, and he knew that it was still attached by a ribbon of flesh. He knew with a spiraling assurance that Telly was dead. One of the red lights fizzled and went out. An aftershock shimmied through them, metal like rubber. Another window not far below and to the right burst in the aftershock, and Gino could see it in the light from the remaining emergency light, and the lady in lavender with big hair was being pressed by the weight of bodies above her, forced through the ragged gap in the glass like one of those kids' molds-shaped Play-Doh, forced through a little patterned hole, and he could see her living flesh pressed into the outline of the hole in the glass. The woman's scream was one note, one very high and incredulous note. Gino was vaguely aware and almost surprised that someone was fucking on top of the pile just a few feet away. More laughter, and that scream stopped. And the red light by the window went out too, and someone else screamed that they were drowning, please help them. Gino could feel the coldness in his head spreading. There wasn't much time left. The heart of all life was underneath, beating in the crevice, the living crevice of people. Very deliberately, Gino plunged into the crevice head first. He liked the way it felt as he went down, like it was a throat and his body was a dick. He thought, that's really how it feels. And then he hit the bottom of the shaft and was plunged under the surface of the mingled liquids there, salty and shitty, and he squirmed around, holding his breath, till he got his legs under him and stood up on someone's dead face and on someone else's, an arm, and felt another vertical crevice in the jigsaw of bodies open in front of him, warm and wet and suffering, and it was just what he was probing for. So he pulled off his clothes, all of them, and forced himself into the crevice in the canyon of bodies head first, and squirmed immediately forward and thought it was serendipitous how the blood and the other liquids had become lubricants here, and how remarkably easy to move it was, so long as he stayed more or less horizontal, and how there were pockets of air to breathe, as he was still above most of the seawater, and how marvelously indifferent he felt when someone in psychotic agony sank their teeth in his shoulder and sawed at it. How it felt rather good, in fact, and merely felt cold when he tore himself away, losing a chunk of shoulder, and forced himself into a steaming gap, which he realized was the gut of a human being. He was actually working through the center of a living person, the wound flesh tight as sex around him, the smell hideous, but they didn't seem to feel it. He could feel the crooked end of their halved spines scraping along his own backbone. Sometimes he heard voices, whispers, mutters, weeping, rising and falling as a whole, as if by some consensual signal. Other times it was echoingly silent, or maybe it was just his hearing shutting off at intervals. He could taste nothing, smell little, and he was grateful for that, but his skin was exquisitely alive, and he realized he had a hard-on, and he dragged it, furrowing it along the bodies, the wet fabric and flesh, and humped now and then, and squirmed onward, remembering maggots he'd seen in a sealed jelly jar that had so outraged his father 19 years earlier, and nosing worm-like through darkness, and then realizing that he had found his way to 2 full, bloody wet breasts. A woman below him was oozing himself over her from her head to her feet, and she was alive, and put her arms around him, but then he found another woman. This one turned the other way, and he felt her hand on him, guiding it into her as the weight of bodies shifted around them, increased with another aftershock, a shift of the subway car, and pressed down on them so they could scarcely breathe. And somehow he understood with what might have been the telepathy of human minds under incredible pressurization. She wanted to copulate with him because it was the most life-confirming thing she could do at that moment with her body. She couldn't get out, And this was all that was left, this praying with the body, one person into another. Each thrust of her hips and his cock saying, I am here, I was here, I am alive, I was alive, this is alive. You acknowledge me more deeply than in the puniness of talk and hand-holding and kissing. You acknowledge in me the reproductive impulse that connects to life. You fuck your way toward recognition. You come into me, I'm here, I'm alive, I was, I am, I was. The pressure increasing, no more breathing, no more air, oxygen starvation, forcing their minds from their bodies, entwining to rise together, wet, locked together in life, in death. And he ejaculated into the void of death.